So this is just a quick presentation because as I was doing some research on what kind of things we would talk about during this virtual workshop, we all know that it's the season of Thanksgiving holiday and other fall traditions, and those are the kind of things that we wanted to highlight during this workshop. However, as I was doing my research, it's always a learning experience. As we know, as parents, we're always learning things to teach our children. And one thing I was learning about Thanksgiving is that it means different things to different people at this time. And so many people see it in extremely different ways. So I prepared this PowerPoint to just share a little bit about what I learned. So it says Thanksgiving, it's a time of traditions, celebration, gratitude, and also some see it as even a time of mourning. Thanksgiving has different meanings for different people. Some see it, let me move this thing out the way, sorry. Is that little black box there? Okay. Some see it as a day to celebrate family traditions and gatherings together. Others see it as a day of remembrance. November is National Native American Heritage Month. So that's something you may have already started hearing about, especially from some of your kids at school, if you have school-age children, or you may have started seeing things about it on the news. So just keep in mind that November every year is when we recognize Native American Heritage Month. And with that being said, many in the Native American community see Thanksgiving as a day of mourning. It's actually a recognized day as a national day of mourning, where many American Indians and other Native Americans see it as a day not to celebrate, but a day when they remember some of the things that happened that were not so pleasant in their history. The true history of the American Thanksgiving is complex, and many of us have not been taught what really happened. So I have these links. I'm going to share this PowerPoint with you by email if you want to do more research. But as parents and coaches and educators, it is our responsibility to learn the truth and teach it to our children in a socially responsible way. And there's many sites where you get information, but I found some sites that were really good, especially if you have young children, if you want to teach them more about the truth and the American Indian perspective on Thanksgiving. Some culturally responsible ways that we can do Thanksgiving or just recognize things during the season. We can read children's books with our children that teach about the Native American culture. And there are several at the library or online. You can find things on YouTube. There's several books that I found. This was one, I'm giving thanks, that was really good. You can do crafts, which we will do today, that focus on gratitude. And you can try cooking a traditional Native American dish with your children, such as fry bread. We're going to be cooking with squash, which is one of the vegetables, really it's a fruit because of the seeds, but it's one of the items that was probably available around at the time of the first Thanksgiving. So you'll be learning about how to cook with squash, butternut squash in particular. One thing I learned is that the land where JFCS sits in the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania area actually was the land originally of the Lenape people. They were the original inhabitants of Delaware, New Jersey, Eastern Pennsylvania, and Southern New York. And for over 10,000 years, they had become the caretakers of these lands and the river of human beings, which we now call the Delaware River. The Lenape were the first tribe to sign a treaty with the United States and the first tribe to have land set aside for them in New Jersey. I'm going to share a link with you that you can look on there and you can find out the native people that were originally on the land by putting in the zip code and the address, and you can find out anywhere in the United States where different people were before this country was developed into what we more so know it now as the United States of America. Who are the Lenape people? Over a period of 250 years, many Lenape people were removed and dispersed throughout the country. Some took refuge with other tribes. A large number of Lenape families remained in the homelands and continue the traditions of their ancestors up to our present day. Today, the Lenape people from all over Turtle Island, which is what they call North America, are revitalizing their communities. Many places in Pennsylvania are derived from the Lenape language, such as Manayunk, many of you heard of, Conshohocken, the Neshaminy. That's why we hear all those kind of those names that sound like that. And those are some, to mention a few, they derive from the Lenape people. In the city of Philadelphia at 2 North Market Street, there's a statue of Chief Tamanin, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who was a revered leader among the Lenape, who signed many treaties with William Penn. The history of Lenape is truly the history of Pennsylvania. And I just saw that statue in person, and it's a beautiful statue if you're around Front and Market. It's like we probably drive past it or walk past it many times and didn't even realize it was there. But that is the chief, one of the chief leaders of the Lenape tribe. For more information, we have these links, and I will be sharing this with you. So if you want to find out more about the Lenape people, as well as other feelings about Thanksgiving and ways to have a more inclusive Thanksgiving with your family, I'll share this with you.
Welcome. It's an honor to be here, and yes, Thanksgiving is, I mean, as families and dynamics and histories go, can be a complicated holiday. And it was interesting to hear from Melissa, even thinking about how, you know, some folks do see this as a time of mourning, and I will definitely be talking about that at our Thanksgiving table this year. One thing along the lines of what Melissa was also talking about is that when European settlers came here, they actually didn't know how to farm in North America. Farming in different climates in different parts of the world is drastically different. And so the food on the original Thanksgiving table was grown by the farming practices of the Lenape people who were here at the time. And one thing that is sometimes stressed is that when settlers first came here, they didn't even realize that the Lenape people were, or Native Americans in general, were farming, because they didn't farm in straight rows in fenced areas, as a lot of European farms and gardens usually have a much more kind of a square fence and then rows inside, where a more traditional way of farming here at the time was to use the natural landscape, but also to grow different foods together that actually went well together. So the 3 sisters that were corn, beans, and squash, and the corn would grow tall, and corn as a plant provides, you know, certain nutrients, but also takes a lot from the soil. Beans as a plant give a lot back to the soil. So some folks will actually grow beans as a natural fertilizer. So those 2 things kind of grew congruently, and they would grow pole beans that would grow up the stalk of the corn. So they kind of used what was already there to provide the best environment for the beans to grow, and then squash would grow low to the ground. And as far as nutrients that plants take from the soil, squash was in between, but its purpose in that context was to kind of as a natural mulch to prevent other weeds from growing. So it was a pretty brilliant way of growing food. And believe it or not, it was so smart that corns, beans, and squash, if eaten together, provide a complete meal. They have the essential nutrients and amino acids you need to kind of in a sciencey brain kind of way have a really complete nutritious meal. So always learning about the histories of those foods can be incredibly important. So today we're going to make two different squash recipes. Both I kind of have switched back and forth with having at Thanksgiving. One is like a way to sneak some vegetables into kids' food, and the other one is a truly really healthy, nutritious meal. We'll eat it actually a lot, maybe the day after Thanksgiving when we're full. We've eaten our Thanksgiving leftover sandwiches. Butternut squash can be a little bit difficult to work with. For one thing I started doing is you can put a whole butternut squash just like this, doing nothing to it, right in your oven. You can put it just on the oven rack or in a pan, and roast it until it's soft, and then cut it the way I'm about to show you. And that's easier, especially if it hurts your wrist to cut something that's really hard. That's a great alternative, and I suggest that for any butternut squash recipe. I also sometimes find that if my squash is kind of unwieldy, cutting it in half this way first will make it 2 smaller pieces. I feel like I'm cheating because the leftover butternut squash I had is a very small one. So I'm gonna make this look a little bit easier. But then, so then I'm gonna cut the neck part of it, the long part of it, long ways. And I'm being sure that when I'm cutting something hard, I'm putting my hand on top of my knife. All right. And both of these recipes start the same way, with a butternut squash in the oven. So I cut it long ways, and then the bottom half, I'm gonna do this way. All right, and then in the middle, you will see that I have some seeds. I can just take a spoon and scoop this out. If you've roasted in advance, this scooping piece will be, you'll just do really gently. You'll see that the whole kind of squash wants to come out with your spoon. But you can use a little bit more force.
So is it easier to roast it with the seeds in or take them out first?
You know what, Melissa? I honestly have become a really big fan of just roasting the whole squash. This whole squash whole. Most recipes won't recommend you do that because you're not going to get kind of the flavor of the onions and the roasting and the browning in the squash. You could always return it to the oven, and I think it comes out great either way. And it's just so much easier.
Okay.
Most recipes will call for you to cut the squash while it's raw. So so I would put this in the oven for my soup. I would kind of stuff all of the vegetables, the garlic and the onion. This butternut squash soup recipe used nutmeg and cinnamon. You can use any flavor profile. I've used, I've done it with curry and made kind of a curried butternut squash soup. I've done it with a ton of just like ginger and then squeeze lemon at the end. It's a really, it's a really versatile soup. We prepare our squash, we put it in the oven, we either roast it whole or half. And then what I'm going to demonstrate to you today is how to make the beginning of the mac and cheese. And then while part of that cooks, I'll show you how to put together the soup because it takes under 5 minutes, and then we'll finish off our mac and cheese. Sound good? Butternut squash mac and cheese. We're going to take our butternut squash that's been roasted, and you can see it's really soft. It's super soft here. I'm going to scrape a little bit into a food processor to mash it up, just kind of in the interest of time. Scooping the insides out and mashing squash is a great job for kids. So first of all, if you get a little bit of the skins in it, it's not a big deal. It just kind of disappears.
Can you do it in a blender, or do you have to have a food processor?
Nope, you don't have to have a food processor or a blender. So you scoop it out, and then honestly, if my daughter was here, I would skip the food processor piece, and I would give her a pair of rubber gloves because her hands never get quite that clean, and put it in a bowl, and she just mashes it up with her hands, and it gets really perfect. You can also do it with a fork. I let her do it with her hands once, and we're never coming back from that though. Diced onion. So one of the first parts of this recipe is actually going to be sauteing an onion and a little bit of garlic. So it's just half of an onion, and you want to just dice it small. And I'm making sure I'm conscious of my fingers. If you are cooking this with kids and you want another job for kiddos, you can give them a cheese grater. Make sure you suggest they watch their knuckles, but you can grate the onion for this recipe too. And then after I mince this onion, chop this onion, I'm gonna saute in a little bit of butter. It's a huge onion, so I'm just gonna do that much. Add some garlic, add some flour and some milk, and that'll be the base of my cheese sauce. This macaroni and cheese recipe is not baked. You could at the end throw breadcrumbs on it and put it in the oven, and it would be very delicious. If you want to do this entirely on a stovetop too, butternut squash is not something that works in a toaster oven great. It's just a little too hard, but you can peel and seed the butternut squash and boil it and strain it too. So you'd almost boil it like pasta until it's soft. All right, let's see how. All right, so I'm gonna melt my butter, and then I'm gonna saute my onion and garlic, and then I'm gonna add flour to make a little bit of a paste, and then I'm gonna add my milk, and I wanna show you my nifty measuring utensils I've used today. So it's 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of butter. Soup spoon is a tablespoon. So if you don't have a specifically designated measuring spoon, you can use just a larger spoon and just do 2 scoops. And then similarly, when I do butter, you can just kind of eyeball, you can do the same thing, just take kind of 2 scoops. A lot of butter will say it on the side, what is 2 tablespoons. But I like this recipe because you can kind of guess at most things. Also, if you have one of these containers, I'm pretty sure like wonton soup came in this for us. This is 2 cups. So if something is for 2 cups of milk, my cheese actually came in one. I thought about using just the same one for that. All right, so my butter is melted. I'm gonna add my onions. Melissa.
Also a good child-centered activity coaches, as Drew was saying, she cooks with her daughter. So this is really something we can engage our children with and make it a child-centered activity and do some child-directed play through this whole, even if they're mashing up the squash or measuring things out, they're having fun with it.
Squash with everything roasted in it. And I'm literally just I'm gonna scrape it. This is another, good job for kids is scraping the squash out. It gets messy, but it's worth it. There's so many good activities for kiddos in this. I even sometimes when we're learning to count, we'll just like tell my daughter that we need like to count the pasta. We'll just let her count. I just added my garlic for a second there because I realize you can't see my stove. I don't really want it. I don't want the garlic to burn. When garlic burns, it becomes bitter. So now I'm gonna add flour to my butter, and flour is raw. Flour is an ingredient that needs to be cooked. The thing that makes people, and I'm giving this stir, the thing that makes people sick from eating raw cookie dough is actually not usually eggs. It's usually the flour. And so this is really important. I want to let that flour brown a little bit. Even if it starts to stick, that is okay. And this is any kind of cream soup or cheese sauce. You're going to start this way. So you can see I'm just stirring it. And I'm making sure that I'm really cooking my flour. And I'm going to wait until I always describe the moment where you become a little bit uncomfortable, like you're a little worried that things are really going to stick. That's when you add your milk.
Okay.
So now I'm going to add my milk, and I'm going to add a little bit in and give it a little stir, and a little in and give it a stir, a little in and give it a stir. Can you see that it's almost making a paste?
Mhm.
So I've got my squash. So this recipe, roast it. Any juices in the bottom of your pan, you want to go into your pot. Just nice and mashed up like this. So once again, if you want it really fine, you can put it in a blender. And then I'm gonna add just a little bit of vegetable stock or chicken stock or coconut milk. Delicious. Taste it for some pepper. And yeah, that's the butternut squash soup. So once again, it can be kind of a nice pureed soup, or it can be a chunkier vegetable soup. Same recipe, you can just blend it or not at the end. It's also a really great recipe with an immersion blender if you have one of those. Anything with a blade will work. So any questions about that soup recipe?
It looked really good, but I wanted to note something you said at another Friday when we were talking about herbs, because I just did it, or I just used one of them, and I was thinking about that for the soup. When you told us how we can take fresh herbs and put it in the freezer, we could put a little oil and put them in ice cubes in the freezer. Well, I've been doing that. And yesterday I made a dish, and it was so convenient to be able to pull out my fresh garlic from the freezer from my ice cube tray. So I just wanted to let people know that that really is a good hack.
Similarly, this butternut squash soup, I always have a quart of it in my freezer for a hectic night. Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna stir in the squash and the cheese at the same time. So I'm stirring in the squash. And I always use, when I make this mac and cheese, orange cheese, because if it's really orange, my kid is more likely to eat it. And, you know, do what you have to do. The orange mac and cheese or the white mac and cheese, but if it appears to be something in between, it's unacceptable. All right, so I've got my squash. I'm mixing my cheese.
So the squash becomes part of the cheese sauce.
Yeah, so you can see here, this just looks like a cheese sauce now.
Mhm.
I just put half of a butternut squash in here, and you can't really tell. And as soon as I see my cheese, I'm gonna keep stirring it because otherwise my cheese kind of sinks to the bottom and gets stuck. And what I really want is it to be in every crevice of this macaroni. All right, looking good. And so I'm adding my macaroni. All right. I'm not putting this one in the oven until I cook it for the full time because I'm going to just serve it now. If I am going to cook in the oven, I just wait. I cook them until they're almost done. So they're just a little bit toothy, I say. Like they have a little bit of a bite to them, but all different pasta cooks for different lengths of time. So I would just take a minute or two off of the package instructions. So when my grandmother would make leftover pasta, she would just make leftover pasta in the oven, and she would mix breadcrumbs and Parmesan cheese, and it makes the most remarkably crispy topping. And so when I started making a lot of macaroni and cheese, I started doing that, mixing breadcrumbs and Parmesan cheese and baking that. Delicious. It's like